The night air over the desert was heavy with silence, the kind that made a person's skin prickle. The moon hung low and pale, throwing a silver sheen across the dry land. No, in that vast emptiness, every sound felt louder than it should have been. The crunch of boots against the dirt, the nervous neigh of a horse tethered too close, the faint rattle of chains against stone. The frontier carried its own kind of music, and on that night it played a tune of dread and unspoken warnings. She was not meant to be there. A woman in her condition had no business wandering the edge of an army camp, especially when her belly carried new life inside it. Yet something stronger than caution pulled her forward. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps defiance, or perhaps the strange pull of fate that comes when the world itself seems to hold its breath. She had seen the Apache earlier that day, shackled to a post like an animal, his dark eyes burning with pride, even as soldiers spat insults in his face. To many, he was nothing but a condemned man, awaiting execution at dawn. To her, there was something else's shadow behind those eyes, a weight that felt more dangerous than the iron that bound him. The soldiers had laughed at her when she lingered too long, telling her not to waste her pity on a savage. But their drunken voices had long since faded into the night, replaced by the slow crackle of campfires burning low. The camp slept while the desert stayed awake, and in that uneasy stillness, she crept closer. Her hand rested against her belly, as if the unborn child inside might give her strength, though her heart pounded like a drum of war. She told herself she only wanted to see him up close, to look into the face of the man everyone called cursed. They said his people whispered he had been touched by old spirits, that he carried with him an anger older than the land itself. The whites called him a murderer, a savage who had slaughtered men in cold blood. But when she looked into his eyes earlier, she saw something the soldiers could not. There was sorrow hidden beneath his rage, and there was fire that refused to die even in chains. It was that fire that drew her, even when she wanted to turn away. The chains clinked as he shifted in the dirt, his body tense, his breathing slow and measured. When she came close enough for him to notice, he lifted his head. Moonlight revealed his face, stern and proud, but carved with hardship. He did not beg, he did not speak. He only stared at her as if measuring her soul. And in that stare, she felt the weight of centuries, as though the ground itself had eyes and was watching through him. Her voice shook when she whispered, asking if he was in pain. No answer. Her words seemed foolish in the desert air. But she stayed, unable to leave, her hand tightening over her belly as the night wind carried the smell of sage and smoke. She felt both safe and unsafe at once, caught in a strange balance. Somewhere in the camp, a coyote howled. The sound carried across the stillness, thin and haunting, a reminder that the wilderness did not sleep. The Apache's eyes flicked in that direction, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, rough like stone, grinding against stone, and his words were not in English. She could not understand, yet his tone left her chilled. It was not a plea. It was something closer to a warning. Her mind told her to leave, to run back to her tent, to curl against her blanket and pray for morning. But her body disobeyed, stepping closer until she could see the cruel bite of iron shackles cutting into his wrists. She imagined the pain of carrying life while another carried chains, and for reasons she could not name, she reached down. Her fingers brushed the cold iron, and in that moment his gaze locked with hers. It was not right what she did next. She knew it even as she fumbled with the key she had stolen from a careless soldier earlier that day. The key was meant for nothing more than a foolish dare she had set herself, proof that she could take something without being noticed. Yet now, as it slid into the lock, she realized that fate had tricked her. The chain snapped free with a sound that seemed louder than thunder in the quiet camp. The Apache did not move at first. He watched her, his eyes unreadable, his chest rising and falling slowly, as if he were holding back something immense. Then, with a strength that startled her, he pulled against the final shackle, and the iron gave way. He stood tall, stretching his limbs, as if reclaiming the night itself. Her breath caught in her throat. She expected him to run, to vanish into the desert shadows. Instead, he stayed still, standing over her like a figure carved from stone, the moon casting sharp lines across his face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he leaned closer, his voice low, his words slow enough for her to catch. "You opened the door." She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, a wind rose over the camp, stronger than it should have been. The fires flickered wildly, throwing sparks into the air. Horses snorted and stamped their hooves, restless as if they sensed something wrong. Even the earth seemed to shift, a tremor so faint she wondered if her fear had imagined it. The Apache lifted his head to the sky, his expression dark and heavy. He muttered words in his own tongue, words she could not understand, but that made her skin crawl. She felt as though the ground itself was listening, as though the night had changed shape the moment the chains fell. She stumbled back, clutching her belly, her mind racing with questions she could not put into words. She had thought she was freeing a man. She had thought her act of kindness might carry some meaning. But as the wind whistled through the camp and the shadows lengthened unnaturally, she realized she had done something else entirely. The Apache finally looked back at her, his eyes no longer just sorrowful or proud, but carrying something deeper, something that made her shiver. "The chains held more than me," he said in a voice that seemed to echo beyond his own. Her heart pounded, her breath quick and shallow. She wanted to deny it, to believe this was only her fear speaking louder than reason, yet the silence that followed was too thick, too unnatural. In the far distance, the coyote cried again, but this time it sounded less like an animal and more like a lament. The unborn child shifted inside her, and she wrapped her arms protectively across her belly, caught between instinct and terror. She did not yet understand the horror she had unleashed, nor the price her mercy would demand. But in that desert night, with the chains lying broken at her feet, she knew one thing with certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. The night carried her mistake into silence, as though the desert itself had swallowed her secret. She stood frozen in the moonlight, staring at the broken chains on the ground, her breath shallow, her body trembling. The Apache man towered over her, free now, his shoulders broad and steady, yet his eyes carried a weight that pressed against her chest. She wanted to speak, to explain that she meant only kindness, but no words rose to her lips. Instead, she felt her unborn child stir again, reminding her that she was not alone in this choice. The camp behind them stirred faintly. Somewhere in the dark, a soldier coughed in his sleep. The horses tugged nervously against their tethers, their hooves scraping the dirt, their ears flicking as if they heard something the humans could not. She felt certain that the sound of the lock snapping would carry across the camp like a gunshot, yet no alarm came. Only that restless wind whistled through the mesquite, carrying with it a smell of dust and old smoke. The Apache spoke again, his words strange and low, spoken in the tongue of his people. She could not understand, but the cadence sent a shiver up her spine. His voice was not pleading. It was steady, like a chant, as though the desert itself bent its ear to hear. She thought of the stories the settlers told, about spirits bound to the land, about curses that lingered long after the living were gone. She had laughed at such tales before, but now she felt them breathing against her skin. When he finally shifted his gaze back to her, she saw no gratitude in his eyes. Only certainty, as though he had known this moment would come. "You should not have touched the chains," he said in broken English, his voice rough. "Now it is awake." The words chilled her, and yet she could not pull away. She tried to ask what he meant, but her lips parted without sound. Her throat was dry, her tongue heavy. Somewhere deep inside her she felt an ache that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. It was the ache of fear, of knowing she had opened a door she could not close. The Apache straightened, his body strong despite the days in captivity. He looked toward the mountains beyond the desert, where the horizon seemed to hum under the moonlight. Then, without warning, he moved past her, silent as shadow. She turned quickly, afraid he might harm her, but he did not. He walked into the darkness beyond the campfires, each step measured, as if following a path only he could see. She should have let him go. She should have turned back to her tent, pulled a blanket over her head, and prayed for the dawn to come quickly. But her feet betrayed her heart, carrying her after him, her hands instinctively guarding the life within her. She followed at a distance, her breath tight, her body weary, yet curiosity stronger than her fear. The desert stretched endless and open around them. Every bush and rock seemed alive with whispers. The stars burned clear and sharp above, as if watching this small and reckless woman trail a man who should have been dead by sunrise. Her mind spun with questions. Why had she freed him? Why did his words linger like a shadow over her thoughts? And what did he mean when he spoke of something being awake? Her life before this night had been ordinary enough, or as ordinary as life could be on the edge of the frontier. She had been raised in hardship. Her father a farmer whose crops barely kept hunger away. Her mother a woman hardened by wind and loss. She had married young, out of necessity rather than choice, and soon found herself widowed by sickness that struck faster than the preacher could pray. Now she lived in a settlement that clung stubbornly to the desert's edge, carrying her unborn child and working where she could, always with an air of quiet endurance. She had known loneliness, but never the kind of fear that pressed on her now. The soldiers in camp treated her with a mix of disregard and condescension, seeing her as a woman with no protector. They kept her near because she could cook and wash and tend to simple needs, though they never trusted her with anything more. Perhaps that was why she had taken the key in the first place, out of spite, out of boredom, or maybe out of a desperate need to feel she still held some power in a world that had taken so much from her. She never imagined the key would change her fate. The Apache stopped suddenly ahead of her and she froze. His posture was tense, his head tilted toward the horizon. For a moment, she thought he had discovered her following, but then she realized he was listening. The night was not silent anymore. Somewhere faintly, there came a sound like a low hum beneath the earth, so faint she thought it must be her imagination. But the Apache's shoulders stiffened, and she knew it was real. He turned and looked at her, his gaze sharp. "Go back," he said simply. She wanted to obey. Every part of her screamed to turn and run, to hide behind the safety of soldiers and rifles, yet she could not. Something about the weight of his words made her believe that the soldiers would be no protection at all. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice shaking. His jaw tightened. "The chains were not only for me, they were for what walks with me." Her breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. She thought of old stories whispered by travelers' tales of spirits bound to men, of dark forces tied to bloodlines, of oaths that could never be broken. She had dismissed them as superstition. Now, with the earth humming faintly beneath her feet and the night air thick with dread, she could not dismiss anything. The Apache looked back toward the camp, where the faint glow of dying fires flickered in the distance. His expression was grim. "We'll not see it coming," he murmured. "None of them." She hugged her belly tightly, fear and confusion twisting inside her. She had wanted to act with mercy. She had wanted to defy the cruelty of men who laughed at another's suffering. Instead, she had unbound something she did not understand. The wind shifted again, stronger now, carrying with it a low whistle that seemed to circle them. She glanced around wildly, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. The desert looked the same, open and endless, yet her instincts told her it was not the same at all. The air itself felt wrong, heavy and alive. The Apache crouched low, pressing his palm against the dirt. His lips moved silently, as though in prayer or warning. She took a step closer, unable to keep herself away, and whispered again, "What did I do?" He lifted his head, his eyes dark and steady. "You broke the balance." Her knees weakened, and she gripped her belly, terrified for the child within her. She wanted to scream at him, to explain, to tell her what horror she had called forth, but before she could, a sound ripped across the night. It was not the cry of a coyote this time. It was deeper, louder, like something tearing itself out of the earth. The ground trembled beneath her feet, just for a moment, and her breath caught in her throat. The Apache rose swiftly, his hand tightening into a fist, his eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting something to appear. She wanted to turn back, to run for the safety of the camp, but her body stayed rooted, paralyzed by fear and fascination. The desert no longer felt empty, felt crowded, thick with something unseen but near. The Apache's voice was low, calm, but hard as flint. "Now it comes." Her mouth went dry, her heart thrashed. She did not ask what he meant because some part of her already knew. She'd opened a door. Something had stepped through. The sound that tore through the desert that night did not belong to any creature she had known. It was deep and resonant, like a drum struck beneath the ground, rolling outward through the dry earth and echoing against the mountains. The noise faded slowly, leaving behind an uneasy silence so heavy it seemed to press down on her chest. She clutched her belly tighter, feeling her child stir within, and wondered if even the unborn could sense the dread carried in that sound. The Apache stood with his back straight, his face turned to the horizon as though he were listening to something she could not hear. His features were cut sharp by the moonlight, his eyes reflecting not fear, but grim recognition. He had expected this, realized then that he had been waiting for it, perhaps for days, perhaps longer. Behind them, the camp lay quiet, unaware of the weight that had shifted in the desert night. Men slept with their rifles close at hand, their trust in iron and powder strong enough to blind them to what stirred beyond their fires. She thought of warning them, running back to cry out that danger was near, but something in her heart told her they would not listen. They would laugh again, call her foolish, or worse, accuse her of hysteria. And what words could she even use? She did not know the shape of the danger, only the certainty that it was real. The Apache finally spoke, his voice low and steady. The ground remembers. The wind remembers. You opened the lock, and now what was bound will follow. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Follow you." He shook his head slowly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Not me, us." The weight of his words settled heavy in her bones. It was not just the soldiers in danger, it was her. It was the child she carried. Though she wanted to turn back, to retreat into the fragile illusion of safety, she could not. Some bond, invisible but unbreakable, tied her to the decision she had made when she turned the key. The wind picked up again, sharper now, sweeping across the scrub and scattering dust into the air. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The Apache began walking again, his stride purposeful, and though every instinct told her to stay behind, she followed. They reached a ridge that overlooked the desert floor, and there he stopped. Below, the land stretched in all directions, pale and endless under the moonlight. But it was not the emptiness that held their attention. In the far distance, shadows moved against the ground, faint and shifting like smoke rising where no fire burned.
Ow.
She squinted, trying to make sense of what she saw, but the harder she looked, the less clear it became. Shapes flickered and dissolved, reappearing in places they had not been before. They looked human and not human at once. Breath caught. "What is it?" The Apache's voice was quiet, but filled with a weight that carried beyond words. "The forgotten, they have no bodies now, but the chains kept them still. You broke them free." The sound she had heard earlier rose again, distant yet louder this time, rolling over the desert like a wave. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it did not block it out. It was not just sound. It was a feeling that sank into her bones, rattling through her chest and making her heart stutter. The child within her kicked, as if protesting the weight of it. Fear gripped her throat, but another emotion stirred beneath it: guilt. I thought of how simple her act had been, how quick. A turn of the key, a snap of iron. It had felt like a small rebellion, a moment of kindness against cruelty. But kindness without understanding, she now saw, could be as dangerous as cruelty itself. The Apache turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "You carry life. That is why they will be drawn to you." Her knees weakened, and she nearly stumbled. "Why me?" she whispered, desperation in her tone. He did not answer at once, his eyes locked on the shifting figures far below. Finally, he said, "They hunger for what they lost. Blood. Breath. The future. You are a door." The words struck her harder than the wind, harder than the sound rumbling across the desert. She wanted to deny it, to insist that she was just a woman, fragile and unimportant, carrying nothing but the hope of one small life. But something inside her, the same instinct that had told her the desert was not empty, knew. He spoke truth. The shadows on the desert floor seemed to grow, spreading outward, drawing closer to the ridge. The Apache tightened his fists, his body tense, but he did not move to run. Instead, he began to hum low in his throat, a sound that carried strange power, deep and steady, older than any prayer she had ever heard. It was not meant for her. It was meant for them, for the shifting things that crept closer in the night. She sank to the ground, her body trembling, her hand pressed hard against her belly. She wanted to close her eyes, but she could not. She had to watch, had to see what her mistake had called forth. The shadows rippled like water, drawing shapes that almost resembled faces. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw eyes glinting back at her, hungry and hollow. The Apache's hum grew louder, his voice carrying against the wind. The shadows faltered, their movement slowing, but they did not vanish. They circled, restless, as though testing the strength of the sound that held them at bay. She realized then that he was fighting them, not with weapon or fist, but with will and voice. And she realized something else: without him, she would already be lost. Back at the camp, faint shouts rose, carried by the wind. The soldiers were stirring, perhaps awakened by the tremors, perhaps by the restless horses that had sensed what men could not. Lights flickered as torches were lit, voices rising in confusion, but their noise was distant, like an afterthought. Here on the ridge, only the hum of the Apache and the circling shadows mattered. For the first time since freeing him, she found her voice. Can they be stopped? The Apache did not look at her, his eyes still locked on the shifting darkness. Not stopped, only bound. But the chains are broken now. Her heart sank at his words. She thought of the soldiers, of their rifles and bravado, of their laughter at the idea of curses and spirits. None of that would matter now. Iron and powder could not bind shadows. She had loosed something they could never cage again. The night deepened, the stars blazing bright overhead, but the desert no longer looked the same. It breathed, it shifted, it felt alive in ways it never had before. Every rustle of brush, every gust of wind felt like a whisper meant for her. She hugged her belly close, whispering to the child inside that she would protect it, though she no longer knew how. The Apache's voice faltered for a moment, and in that instant, one of the shadows surged forward, stretching long across the sand. Her breath caught, terror freezing her in place. But with a growl low in his throat, the Apache's hum rose again, stronger, forcing it back. He swayed slightly, as though the effort drained him, but he held firm. She realized then that his chains had not only held him, but kept these restless things tethered. He had been both prisoner and guardian, bound not for what he had done, but for what he carried with him. By setting him free, she had unbound the land itself. The shadows pulled back, circling once more, waiting, patient. The Apache finally lowered his voice, his body sagging with exhaustion. He turned his gaze to her, his face stern. This is only the beginning. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body trembling. She wanted to ask what came next, but the words died before they left her lips. She already knew. The night had only just begun, and what followed would test them both in ways neither iron nor flesh could prepare them for. The night pressed down heavier than before, as though the desert itself had grown teeth. She could feel the weight of it in her lungs with every breath, sharp and raw. The Apache stood like stone at the edge of the ridge, his figure outlined by the pale moonlight, while the shadows below moved like restless waves on an endless sea. They no longer drifted aimlessly. They were gathering, and each moment drew them closer to the ridge where she and the Apache stood. Her hand never left her swollen belly, a desperate shield against a threat she did not understand. The child stirred again, restless as though it too felt the pull of whatever force crept through the desert. She whispered to the life inside her, trying to soothe both herself and the little one. But her voice broke against the sound of the wind that now howled through the rocks like 1,000 whispers. The Apache's hum had fallen silent. His chest rose and fell with exhaustion, his gaze still locked on the moving darkness. She dared to speak, her words thin and fragile. What do they want? His jaw tightened, and though his voice was calm, there was no comfort in it. They want what was taken. They want blood, breath, warmth. They want life. The answer made her knees weaken. She leaned against a boulder for support, fighting the terror that clawed at her throat. It was not just the soldiers they wanted. It was her. It was her unborn child. The thought burned through her chest like fire, stronger than any fear she had known before. The faint sounds of commotion drifted from the camp below. Men shouted, their voices sharp with confusion. Horses screamed, hooves striking against the dirt. She could picture the soldiers running to and fro, lighting torches, clutching rifles, cursing into the night without understanding the danger pressing down around them. Her weapons would be useless. She knew that now. Iron could not kill shadows. The Apache turned to her, his expression severe. They are close enough to taste the camp. The men will not understand until it is too late. She looked back toward the glow of the torches, her heart torn. The soldiers had mocked her, treated her like she was nothing more than a burden. yet they were still men of flesh and blood. Did they deserve to be consumed by something older than time itself? Could she let them die for her mistake? The Apache seemed to read her thoughts. You did not know what you freed.
Ow.
Mercy does not excuse, but it explains. Still, you cannot undo. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to scream that she would undo it if she could, that she would lock him in chains again if that would set things right. But she knew it was a lie. Once the key had turned, there was no going back. The shadows below began to rise, stretching tall against the desert floor. Some took shapes that mocked the human form, long limbs and hollow faces that flickered in and out of sight. Others were nothing more than thick darkness that rolled like storm clouds. They moved toward the camp, silent and steady, and the wind carried with it the unmistakable sound of men shouting in terror. The Apache stepped forward, his voice sharp. Stay here, but she could not. Fear rooted her body, yet something stronger than fear pushed her forward. She followed him down the slope of the ridge, her steps unsteady on the rocky path. The night swallowed them as they descended, and each step brought the sounds of the camp louder into her ears. Gunshots cracked, rifles fired blindly into the dark, but the bullets made no dent in the creeping tide. She could hear men screaming, horses breaking free of their tethers, chaos spilling across the desert floor. By the time they reached the edge of the camp, it was already unraveling. Soldiers ran through the flickering light of torches, their faces pale and twisted with panic.
Oh.
Some swung rifles like clubs, others dropped to their knees in prayer. The shadows had seeped into the camp like water through cracks, slipping between tents, curling around men's legs, pulling them down into the dirt. She clung to the Apache's arm, terror clawing at her throat, but he did not falter. He moved with the steady grace of one who had walked with death before. His voice rose again, low and rhythmic, that same hum that had held the shadows back on the ridge. For a moment, the darkness near them faltered, recoiling like smoke against wind. The soldiers noticed. One of them, wild-eyed and desperate, shouted, "He's with them." A rifle was raised, the barrel aimed straight at the Apache. Without thinking, she stepped in front of him, her arms outstretched. "No," she cried, her voice raw. "He's the only thing holding them back." The soldier hesitated, his eyes darting between the creeping shadows and the proud figure of the Apache. Then another man screamed as a dark shape swallowed him whole, and the rifle lowered, forgotten in the chaos. The Apache's chant grew stronger, louder now, his voice cutting through the screams. The shadows resisted, writhing against the sound, but they did not retreat fully. They circled, restless, testing the edges of his strength. She could see sweat glistening on his brow, the strain pulling at his body. She wanted to help him, but what could she do? She had no chant, no strength, no weapon against what pressed in around them. All she had was the child inside her and the will to protect. She knelt in the dirt, clutching her belly, whispering prayers she had not spoken since she was a child. Round them, the camp collapsed into ruin. Men fired their rifles until the barrels glowed, then dropped them useless in the dirt. Horses fled into the dark, their screams fading into the distance. Tents caught fire from overturned lanterns, flames licking high into the night, but even fire seemed powerless against the shadows that slithered between the burning canvas. The Apache's chant broke suddenly, his voice choking in his throat. He staggered, and the shadows surged forward with a sound that was neither scream nor roar, but something in between. She reached for him, fear clenching her chest, but he lifted a hand to stop her. His eyes burned with determination, even as his body trembled. "You must not let them touch you," he said, his voice rough. Or the child, her heart hammered, and she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know how." "You will know," he said, his gaze piercing hers. "'Cause you must." The shadows pressed closer, their forms taller, darker, hungrier. The torches sputtered and died, leaving only the glow of flames from burning tents. Men fled into the night, their shouts fading until the desert swallowed them whole. Only she and the Apache remained in the heart of the camp, surrounded by shapes that pulsed and shifted like living nightmares. The child within her kicked again, stronger than before, as though it too sensed the battle drawing near. She whispered to it, begging it to stay strong, to hold on, even as terror gnawed at her bones. The air grew colder, the shadows drawing nearer, their shapes clearer now. She could see faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent cries, eyes hollow and unblinking. The Apache lifted his voice one final time, his chant rising above the howl of the wind, fierce and unyielding. The shadows shuddered, pressing against him, resisting, and she felt the earth tremble beneath her knees. It was building, rising, the air, thick with a pressure that threatened to crush her. She knew the climax was coming, the moment when something would break weather. It was the Apache's strength, the grip of the shadows, or the fragile thread of her own courage. Every breath felt like the last before a storm shatters the sky. And then, with the fire burning high around them and the desert alive with whispers, the shadows surged all at once. The shadows rushed forward like a flood of darkness, filling every space around them, choking the air, swallowing fire and flame as if the desert itself had been consumed. She clung to the ground, holding her belly as though her arms could shield the child inside from forces older than the land. The Apache stood firm at the center, his voice rising in a chant that cracked the night like thunder. His strength seemed almost inhuman, but even she could see it waning, his body trembling against the storm of spirits. For a moment it felt certain they would be overrun. The shadows pressed so close she could see their faces clearly, each one twisted with loss and hunger, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She felt their pull, the weight of centuries of suffering reaching out for her, for the life within her womb. A coldness touched her belly, and terror flooded her heart. She screamed, a raw sound that cut through the wind. The Apache turned his gaze toward her, his chant shifting. His words rose, not just defiant but commanding, as if he were calling on the very desert to hear him. The ground shook, the flames bent with the force of the sound, and the shadows faltered. For the first time, she felt them weaken. The spirits cried out, a sound not made with tongues but with the air itself. Their shapes thinned, stretched, and began to scatter like smoke caught in a storm. They fought against it, lashing out, but the Apache's voice held, steady and unbroken now, as though some final strength had awakened in him. She pressed her face into the dirt, tears streaming, clutching her belly until her arms ached. The unborn child kicked once more, strong and defiant, as if answering the chant that filled the air. She whispered to it through her sobs, promising it safety, promising she would see this night through. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the desert went still. The fire hissed low, the wind died, and the shadows dissolved into nothingness. The silence afterward was so complete it rang in her ears. Smoke drifted from the ruined tents, the glow of dying flames casting the camp in dim light. Bodies lay scattered, many lifeless, others groaning where they had fallen. Horses were gone, men had fled, and the settlement they had built against the wilderness was broken beyond repair. At the center of it all stood the Apache, his shoulders rising and falling in exhaustion. His chant had ended, but the echo of it lingered in the air, as though the desert itself would remember his words for generations. He looked to her, his expression unreadable, though his eyes carried the weight of everything he had endured. She rose slowly, her body weak, her dress torn and stained with dust. Her legs trembled, but she stayed on her feet, her hand never leaving her belly. She moved to him, standing only a breath away, her eyes searching his face. "Are they gone?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Not gone, only bound again. They will never leave this land. But they will not touch you now." Relief flooded her, but it was sharp and fragile, tempered by sorrow as she looked around at the broken camp. So many men had died, their bodies lying still where shadows had taken them. She thought of the laughter, the songs by the fire, the voices that had once filled the nights, and how quickly all had been silenced. She had wanted to protect life, but in freeing him, she had opened a door that cost others theirs. The Apache followed her gaze, his expression grim. They were warned long ago. They chose to chain what they did not understand. Their blood is part of the balance now. Her chest tightened, torn between sorrow and the strange truth of his words. She could not deny what she had seen. This was no cruelty of man alone, but something far older, and those who had dismissed it had paid the price. The wind rose again, gentle this time, carrying with it the smell of sage and smoke. She turned her face into it, breathing deep, and for the first time since the chains had broken, she felt the stirrings of peace. The child within her shifted, not with fear but calmness, as though the danger had passed. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering a promise that this child would know a world beyond chains and shadows. When she opened them again, the Apache had stepped back, his form blending into the desert night. He was no longer a prisoner, no longer bound by iron. He was something more, something tied to the land in ways she would never fully grasp. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice quiet, fragile. "Where the spirits walk," he replied, his words carried by the wind. "They are my burden, not yours. But you will remember, and you will teach the child." That is how balance remains. Tears blurred her vision, though she did not fully understand why. Perhaps it was grief, or gratitude, or simply the weight of surviving. She wanted to ask more, to beg him not to leave her alone in the ruins of the night. But she knew his path was not hers. The Apache turned away, his silhouette tall against the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The desert stretched wide and endless, and within moments he was gone, swallowed by the land that had always claimed him. She stood in the broken camp as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Smoke curled into the morning air, carrying with it the memory of fire and loss. The surviving soldiers moved like ghosts, silent and dazed, their eyes hollow with what they had seen. Some looked to her with suspicion, others with quiet awe, but none spoke. They knew something beyond bullets and chains had passed through the desert that night. She gathered her few belongings from what remained of her tent, her body sore, her spirit heavy, but her resolve firm. She would not stay in that camp of ruin. She would walk away, carrying her child toward whatever future lay waiting. The desert had taught her its lesson in blood and shadow, and she would carry it with her always. As she left the camp behind, each step steady, despite her weariness, she thought of the Apache's words. The chains had been more than iron. They had been balance, a fragile peace between the living and the forgotten. She had broken them, but in doing so, she had learned that mercy carries responsibility, and that life is more than survival, it is a promise to those who come after. The child within her moved again, gentle now, as though agreeing. She smiled faintly through her tears, her heart breaking and healing all at once. The desert stretched before her, harsh and endless, but no longer empty. It was alive with memory, with spirits, with the weight of choices made and paths yet to be walked. She whispered into the morning air, to the child, to the land, to whatever still lingered unseen. "We will remember." And with that, she walked on, leaving behind the chains, the shadows, and the ruin of the night, stepping into the light of a new dawn.